Good evening, everyone. So there's a character in Tim O'Brien's 1990 book, The Things They Carry, that says being dead is like being a long forgotten library book that's up on a bookshelf just waiting to be checked out again. And for me, my great-great-grandfather, Jesse Lee Fisher, is that library book. He was a 19th and early 20th century Congregationalist preacher who moved around the Midwest. He pastored several different churches around the Midwest, and he finally ended up in Omaha, where he is pictured among the leaders of a streetcar labor union strike, and as a result of burnout, attempted suicide and was committed to the Nebraska State Hospital for the Insane, as it was called at the time, in 1910. It is also National Suicide Prevention Month, so that is it's fitting that I am talking about my ancestor here. But yeah, this was researching Jesse's life was my end of COVID project. I wrote most of the book before we got vaccines, so he's definitely been my special interest for a couple of years now. So it's been really fun. I've definitely worn out my Jesse welcome with family. So thank you to everyone who listens still. So by the time he ended up in Omaha, Reverend Jesse Lee Fisher had pastored about 7 different churches throughout the Midwest, including in Ohio. He preached at the Saratoga Congregational Church 1 block west from the Omaha and Council Bluffs Streetcar Company car barn, and through just being in the neighborhood, he would have heard the strikers, he would have heard about the laborers' unrest, and somehow, I never found newspaper articles detailing this, but he ended up speaking at almost every single labor union speech held throughout this strike, for the 2 weeks of the strike. And he, except for one, he got kicked off stage by Sheriff Bradley of Omaha, and used that to his advantage when he was stirring up energy and emotion from the strikers in the resulting meetings. And the best part of this story, when I was researching this whole the whole strike, the streetcar company hired temporary workers to replace their striking workers, and the temporary workers would just steal the money from, steal the fares from the customers. So either way, the company was losing money. So he had a very interesting, colorful life. Every part of the onion that I peeled away, I just kept finding more and more and more, and kept uncovering more about Jesse's life. And he's just this fascinating human being. And I have to acknowledge also now that I definitely only have these records because he was a white man who grew up in a landowning family. He benefited from a lot of privilege, even though he came from a traumatic childhood. His entire family, there's multiple members of his family, suffered from mental illness. Most of them were depressed, and a few of them, his grandmother was declared insane because of senility, so dementia at the time, as it was called at the time. His parents got divorced after 10 years of marriage in 1868. His mother was a school teacher who had graduated from college, and his father was an itinerant Methodist preacher who abandoned his family to go preach in the Midwest, and seen back then as God was supposed to be above your family when you were an itinerant minister back at the time. So that's how it goes. So Jesse ended up being bound out to a Columbus area farmer during the 1870s because his mother couldn't afford to care for him and his relatives were not able to care for him. His older sister was able to do some sewing and teach to supplement his family's income, but he was a little kid. He couldn't do anything. So he later would tell the streetcar workers during one of his strike speeches that he'd been abused by his, it's a wonder he didn't commit patricide to his foster parents, honestly. But he was there until he could work his way out. And he ended, as a result of his just having this unstable childhood, he bounced around as much as possible. He held so many different professions. I found all the newspaper articles. He's got a different profession in every single newspaper article I found out about him from his 20s. He got married in 1884 to his first wife, and she had a kid. And then at some point, he just decided, well, I'm going to go to seminary. And he divorced his first wife. He left her a letter that said, I need to go follow in my father's footsteps, and it was not clear if he meant his actual father or God, so we'll never know, but it's fun to think about. So yeah, he attended Oberlin. He did not graduate because then he went off to Chicago during the World's Fair to become a Columbian Guard. If you really want a sword, you can still find them on eBay. They're like $600. It's ridiculous. And his mother and his sister, while he was, during the 1880s, around the time that he was bouncing around and doing all these odd jobs, his mother and his older sister were both declared insane by the Wayne County, Ohio probate court. His sister actually attempted suicide by jumping in. She did not do it because she was prevented, but she attempted suicide by train in 1886 and then was committed to the Cleveland State Hospital. And one of his uncles in 1864 completed suicide by gunshot. So, as a result of the streetcar strike in Omaha, maybe about half his congregation decided that they didn't really want a preacher who was so political. It just wasn't a good look for them. They didn't have to put up with that. So they called it to a vote. And they voted whether or not to keep him on. And they did vote to keep him, but the third of his congregation that didn't vote for him left. And in the ensuing chaos, he reached out to his colleagues in other churches in Omaha for counsel and tried to figure out, is there anything I can do to stop these people from leaving? Nothing. So he spent the entire summer of 1910 convalescing at his brother-in-law's house in Atlantic, Iowa, which is like the western half of Iowa. And he came back. And then 2 days after he came back, he told his wife that he would be better off, everybody would be better off without him, and he attempted suicide and ended up saving his life. He recovered for 2 weeks in the Swedish hospital a few blocks away from his church and pastorate. And then he was moved about 2 weeks later to the Masonic home in Plattsmouth, which is maybe an hour and a half away from Omaha. I suspect he was moved to Plattsmouth because he was a Mason and he got free or very cheap medical care. And they ended up, he would not stop attempting suicide at the Masonic home. So Douglas County, which is Omaha's county, decided that they would hold an insanity hearing to see if they needed to commit him to the Nebraska State Hospital. And so, spoiler, he did get committed, and they, I'm getting ahead of myself here, hang on. So in those days, somebody would submit to the board that this person, we need to have a hearing to determine if this person is insane. the 3-member board, which was comprised of a county like administrator, a judge, and then a physician, would examine the application. They'd bring the accused in. The physician would examine the accused and then determine, they'd all confer and decide, hey, is this person insane or not? And they decided that a Dr. Tilden examined Jesse on September 15th, 1910, 114 days ago as of Monday. But, and they all conferred, and they were like, yeah, they actually, quote unquote, the well-known clergyman is insane. So they issued a warrant for him to be arrested, but really it was to take him to the state hospital in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I found the 1910 superintendent's report for Nebraska State Hospital. He had the good fortune of being admitted a year that they had to write a report. He is the only minister to have been admitted to the Nebraska State Hospital in 1910. He was one of 122 ministers admitted to state hospitals throughout the country that year. And something I found interesting is that in interviews with some current and retired pastors that I've done, and the research I did on this portion of the information, is that the incidence of depression in the general population is between 20 and 25%, and the same holds true for religious leaders, like ministers, pastors. So they pretty much track, but they have to deal with a lot of, it's a high stakes, high impact, it's a high stakes position, high visibility, high stakes position. So there's a lot of stress to take on that the general public doesn't necessarily take on. Oh. This is, you can tell I have a very dry sense of humor, but hopefully. The local sheriff and one of Jesse's parishioners accompanied him to the state hospital on September 15th. He went straight from the hearing to the hospital. And as they were at the depot, he was like, if I could get, it's a train passing. And he was like, oh, if I could get under those train wheels, all my troubles would be over. And I was like, this is just, I had a lot of fun. This is during COVID, y'all. I was like, cool. I just keep finding everybody in my family. What the heck? So most state hospitals, I have got to thank the Texas State. There's a book that I'll look it up in my. I'm happy to send it to anybody if you want to DM me in my handle, but it's Life at the Texas State Lunatic Asylum, and it was contemporaneous with Jesse's time at Nebraska. So I used the Life at the Texas State Hospital for a lot of the information that I got regarding state hospitals. Most of them were arranged in the Kirkbride plan, which is one central large building with several wings spanning out from the building. As it was supposed to have large, airy windows. The idea was that it was supposed to be, this environment was supposed to be a calming one that patients could recuperate with a lot of light, a lot of air, recreation. Unsurprisingly, mental health care pretty much hasn't changed in 150 years, and they were subject to a lot of overcrowding. These state hospitals throughout the country were subject to overcrowding. By the time that deinstitutionalization started happening in the mid-20th century, the administration would just start closing wings one by one because it was expensive to keep these old buildings and not cost-effective to renovate them and make them more efficient. But the wards tended to be arranged by race, gender, and severity of illness. Jesse flip-flopped between wards 1 and 2 based on my research. That was the cool thing. I just emailed somebody random at the Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services, and I got back a 17-page PDF with all of his records, all that they had. And I was like, this is wild that this person, anyway, I'm surprised I'm allowed to have that because there's a lot of stuff that they will put behind. There's a lot of stuff that they put behind HIPAA, even though they don't have to. And by they, I mean state hospital. Patients tended to perform labor. Of course, labor was seen as good for patient recovery, but it also was a way to save money. And that, shockingly, mental health treatment didn't get a lot of funding back then either. And so they would do a lot. They would do a lot of the basic tasks around the hospital. Jesse worked in the chicken coop quite frequently, and what's interesting to me is that they track the nurses and physicians seem to consider his willingness to help out with chores as evidence that he is better or worse. So by the end of his stay at the hospital, they're like, yeah, he just reads and he won't talk to anybody and he won't do any ward work. And I was like, how do we know that he's just like, yes, he could, he's probably still depressed, but how do we know that he's not just like, absolutely not, I will not do this, this is crap. So I like to think that, but you never know. Oh, and then lastly, I will never forget, his sister was committed at the same time he was to Anna State Hospital in Southern Illinois, and I will never be able to get her records because Illinois requires you to get a court order to do that, if they even have them. And there was card playing, they had weekly dances, they had twice weekly baseball games in the summer for patients. There were picture shows, card playing. Jesse, they complained a lot about Jesse, but there are multiple notes in his records saying that he won't run a rubber or he will, they have to force him to run a rubber. And I was like, what on earth is this? I had to read War and Peace to figure out, yeah, I'm serious. I did, it is good, you should read it. I had to read War and Peace to find out that run a rubber meant play a round of bridge. And it's, so yeah, he just wouldn't play cards. And the thing is, like, if you think about it, he was a minister. Like, ministers at that time didn't approve of card playing. Like, of course he's not going to play. Like, of course he's not going to play cards. It's against his, like, values. So I take issue with, and you also have to consider, like, the notes from the staff at the hospital were from the viewpoint of the providers. So you're not really going to get an unfiltered view of how the patient really felt or what they really believed. And so Jesse was, hydrotherapy was this practice of basically swaddling somebody and strapping them down and applying cold packs or hot packs depending on the type of illness that they had. And you'd strap them in. They had needle showers too, where you would just like restrain somebody in an upright shower, and they would just like blast. It's like a jacuzzi but standing up. And it was said, I can appreciate the sensory aspect of this because it would be nice. It is sometimes really fun it's fun, but not when you're forced to do it, not when you're imprisoned.
Cold water sounds like so much fun.
And one of the, actually, it's interesting that you say cold water is so much fun because one of the treatments recommends a 70-degree cold water bath, and that is about the temperature of Barton Springs. So do with that what you will. Jesse was said one night to have been put in the isolation room, and typically that was a modality used when you were a danger to other patients or to staff. Very stark in my opinion. Oh, and I did not have an opinion of my third grade uncle. This is Jesse's brother-in-law. I did not have an opinion until I found this letter saying, hey, so Jesse married my great-great-grandmother in 1895 when he was at his first pastorate in Nebraska. And she and one of her sisters-in-law decided they were going to try to get Jesse out in like 1915. And so this is a letter from Jesse's brother-in-law, saying, hey, my sister and my sister-in-law are going to try to get this guy out of your hospital. Don't just discourage them if they do show up, please. And this is like before women had the right to vote. And I'm like, I did not have an opinion of my uncle before this. And now I'm like, okay, well, he was saying, hey, nobody's going to be financially responsible for him if you release him. But I also, like, my third grade uncle also owned a farm and like had like he was fine financially. And then so there's a lot. If you take a look at the actual death certificates behind me, Jesse's is on your left and his sister Carrie's is on the right. There is almost no demographic information on their death certificates. These are both certified. I did request both of them. But they just don't keep information on this. Jesse is buried in a cemetery in Atlantic, Iowa, only because his brother-in-law prepaid for the entire family's burial plots when his father-in-law died. His sister Kellye is probably in an unmarked grave on the grounds of the Anna State Hospital. And if you've ever seen that little cemetery, it says ASH on it between 51st and North Loop, that is the Austin State Hospital cemetery, and where there are no stones, there are still bodies. They just didn't have grave markers because they couldn't afford them, and the state probably couldn't afford them either. Oh yeah. So I went on a road trip in 2021 to go around all of his pastorates. I did get to ring a bell. That was kind of cool. But yeah, I wondered if, I remember I just like sat on top, like in between their graves, and I was like, hey, what would they think if I was like, I should treat them with respect? They would probably not like that their great-great-granddaughter is just blowing open the whole story of their lives and my great-great-grandfather's mental illness. And I was like, we should speak out more about this, and we should be more open, because I feel like if I'd known about it, like I did not find out about, my family has almost 200 years of documented mental health issues, and I found out about it because I went and researched it. And imagine like if I'd known about that, like if people are able to prepare for that, at least. Like, it's not going to help your own diagnosis, but it will help how you approach life, in my opinion.
Yay.
Wow, that was really amazing. Thank you for sharing all that. All right, first question.
Hi, I did the math real quick in the gravestone, so he died when he was 70, but I can't remember when he was committed. How long was he in total institutionalized?
20 years.
Hey there. So my question is, I'm curious if anyone back in that time would ever get out of the institution.
Their family basically had to have enough money to take care of them, and willingness to take care of them. My theory is that my third grade uncle, he said nobody would be financially responsible, not because they couldn't be, but because they were unwilling to be. So, yeah, it's pretty much if you had money.
Hello, longtime fan, first-time questioner. So it seems like he had a generally pretty traumatic life, from being found out, pressed into some kind of servitude just to survive childhood, being institutionalized, multiple suicide attempts. But he did still manage to live to 70 years old. Do you think that speaks to, the contemporary effectiveness of the institution's care, or was it just the fact that he was basically imprisoned that kept him alive that long?
I am inclined to believe that him just being imprisoned is what kept him alive that long. He probably got fed a minimum amount of like the food he needed to survive, And like a little part of me hopes he stayed alive out of spite in the hopes that somebody would come get him. But that's just me projecting, so I can't say for sure. Yeah.
Any more questions? Okay, last question.
This may be macabre, but what was the original mechanism he used to attempt suicide, and what were the typical, aside from train wheels, mechanisms? I'm just curious.
Of the research that I did, in chronological order, I heard of guns, trains, and razors. I am not sure. There are multiple accounts of him when he's at the Masonic home attempting suicide, but I don't know if that's just like him expressing a desire to do so, or if that was him, if there was anything available to him at the time.
Okay, one more.
So there's a lot of documentation of him. Did he leave any records himself? Did he ever say anything about it?
He never said anything about his own imprisonment, but I have 3 documents with his handwriting on it, and those are kind of cool. But and there's a lot of Omaha newspaper articles where they've quoted him in speeches, and it's really cool. Like you can. He used to write his own newspaper advertisements for the paper, and you can kind of tell based on some of the language he uses. But my favorite is he did one for Thanksgiving in 1907, I believe, and it just says manifest your thankfulness by coming to the Thanksgiving sermon. And I was like, this is so prescient. I love it. So.
Oh, great. Thank you.